So talking about the actual grid unit setup, we want to change the actual layout so that it doesn't use this random value that doesn't really make sense to us in terms of actually modeling something to scale. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to my display options here at the top. You can see the first option that's available is the grid. So under the grid option box, once I tick that, I'm going to open up the additional options that I want to then go and change the values accordingly. So what makes sense to us, you can pretty much customize this to whatever your liking might be. For what I want to do is I want to set the actual length and width to a value of 1,000. Okay, what's 1,000 units in this case? It's 1,000 centimeters. Okay, 1,000 centimeters is how much meters? 10 meters. Okay, so then I'm going to take my grid lines. I'm going to divide that by 100. Okay, so that means I'm actually giving it grid line every 100 units, which means I'm blocking out exactly 1 meter increments. Does it make sense? And then from there I would change my subdivisions finally to 10, which means for every grid unit blockout we're going to have exactly 10 centimeter increments within those. So you're going to have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 up to 100, and then you have your first grid line. After that it counts again, 10, 20, 30, 40 and so on and so forth. And then lastly, the last thing that I want to do is I want to change the color scheme. You can pretty much change whatever you like. I use more of a grayscale kind of value. It's easier on the eyes and it's not as jarring, especially when you're moving around in your viewport. You don't want to be bombarded with these all rainbow psychedelic colors, unless you want to, obviously. So I'm going to change my axis color to black, my grid lines to medium gray. So just by clicking and dragging the slider you can choose your color, and then finally the subdivision line, just choose the third gray value from there. Everything else you can leave as is. As soon as I hit apply, it's going to change the grid scale to now a much bigger grid. So if you quickly analyze this, from the center of the world we have the thick dark black line. Okay, that's your origin of where every object will essentially be created from and to, unless you change the preferences to draw it as an interactive creation. From there, if I count the lighter gray lines, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the next one is 10. So that's your 10 centimeter increments. And then the next medium gray line is going to represent the first grid line. The first grid line represents 1 meter. So it's very easy to now say, okay, cool, I need to have this exactly, especially when this is set to interactive creation under the create menu. So if I click on, let's say, a polygon plane, and I start off at the middle of the grid and I click and drag, that's going to be 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters. Okay, so I've got a 4 meter box and I want to have it exactly 3 meters deep. And there's my plane. Now it's set exactly 4 meters by 3 meters. So it's very easy to be able to recognize what kind of scale you would expect it. Now if you want to be exact and you want to type in exact values, then once you've created the object, then you can go and type in the exact width and height inside of your channel box under the inputs. So I would say that width would be 300 and my height would be 400. So 400 centimeters or 300 centimeters, that equals to 3 meters, and you know what you're expecting scale. Does that make sense? Epic. Okay, I'm going to give you guys some time to quickly. Right. So once we have this laid out, we can now start thinking about actually building a proper mesh to scale. So it's very easy for us to now to kind of predict what to expect in terms of actual width, height and depth just by looking at the grid, right? Also, when you change the grid options, this will apply to all the other views as well, your front view, your side view and your top view. So if I zoom out, you can see that's 1 meter, So if you want to quickly create a cylinder that's exactly, let's say, 1 meter high, there it is, drag it out, 1 meter, done. Very quick. If you wanted to change the values in between so that they represent 1 centimeter increments, then the grid becomes very dense and difficult to actually see through it. So I typically don't go to that very fine kind of level of detail. I mean, if I really wanted to, I can just look at 10 centimeters and say, okay, 5 is half, you know, and kind of work it out manually. You also have a distance tool in Maya if you wanted to go and measure the width of something. Usually it's when you want to try and figure out from one point or one vertex to another how long an edge is. If you don't have the actual properties, like if you go to the inputs and you look at your width and height, let's say you clear the history, then you don't have that information anymore. Then obviously looking at the grid, I can see that's exactly 4 meters, but if I wanted to be more precise, if I want to have from here to more or less there, how long is that? Then there's an option under the create menu. Then you can go down to measuring, or measured tools rather, and then there's a distance tool. So by clicking on that, it's going to ask you place or pick the first point that you want to start measuring from. Okay, so let's say I want to click on over here once, and then place this little cross. If I zoom in, don't know if it cleared out, and then you want to click anywhere else, and then it's going to create that little path giving you an exact number, 213 units from there to there. Okay, what is the unit type? It's set to centimeters. Then you know it's 83 point blah 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 measuring units. Okay. Once you press enter, it's going to then make it stick and stay there. So if I zoom out and move around, it's always going to stay within the bounds of my view. So it changes its position to kind of compensate for the camera angle. Okay, so I don't need that for now. I was just kind of showing you guys another way of approaching it. Okay, cool. So now let's start off with a box. And this box is going to be the bounds of an actual building. Okay, so just before we get started, I want to quickly jump to the network and allocate a set of images that I will be using for this. Let me just check, where did I put that? I think that's in the full time. It's in the fundamentals, week 1. Nope. Modeling. I have to try to find it quickly. So once I have the image, I'm going to take this image now and I'm going to bring it into Maya as an image plane. There's 2 different ways you can actually bring an image into Maya. The one is through a texture method, which you will project onto a surface, like a building or piece of geometry. Another way would be to actually link it up to the camera, so that when the camera moves, it always sticks to the camera no matter what. So you can link it to a perspective camera, you can link that to a front view, side view, top view, whichever other camera that you've made additionally, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to quickly copy this image and put that one on my desktop, and in fact it's probably be better for me to create a proper project this time and call it house project. Okay, so far we've been working with the new studio project, and my first project, we're going to create another one this time and then set it and then copy that particular image that I just downloaded now. I'm going to put it in the source images so we can quickly have access to that. So just watch me for now. File, project window. I'm going to go to my new over here, give it a name, call it house project. and I will be saving this to my desktop with all these subfolders. Now it's crucial that you have at least the scenes folder and the source images folder. The other stuff, maybe like autosave, would be important. The rest of the stuff we're not going to use for this particular project, but you can leave it as is. There might be kind of like a transition from a very simplified project to a much more complex project at any given point, and then you can start storing more information within the data, and then the clips and sounds. Let's say you're doing motion or a little bit of animation with voiceover, and you want to have an audio clip that you've downloaded. You can put that in your sounds and so on. Okay, we're not going to do that obviously. So going from here, I'm going to hit accept, and then I need to do what after that? I need to set it. Yes. I'm going to go to set project. I'm going to go to my project over here, house project, and say set. And then once I've done that, I can now start essentially modeling and do all those fancy things. Before I do that, I need to do what? Copy that image from my network drive, if I can find it. Class 2, there it is. Copy that, desktop, and then my house project, and then I'm going to copy this image into the source images folder. You have to make sure you put it there. If you don't, it is not a train smash. You just have to redirect your path to whichever folder that you've saved it initially, but it's better to always keep things contained within the project. So that's why we save this into the source images folder, so when we do a file import image plane, that it instantly goes to our source images directory instead of having to go and find it somewhere on my C drive, you know, on a random location. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to quickly set that up. So going from here, we can now go and bring this image plane into Maya as a reference that we can always kind of look at, instead of, especially when you don't have two screens, right? If you have two screens, then your life is a lot easier. But a lot of cases you want more of a direct referencing. Let's say you have a front profile of a character and a side profile of a character, and you want to match it exactly. Then this is also a typical technique that you can use. So going from here, I'm going to address that in all the views so that you guys are aware that you can do it in any of the views depending on whether you want to import it into the front, side, top, or perspective. So if you look at your full pane view layouts, you'll see that each of these have their own kind of panels and set of buttons at the top of your viewport. So each of these have their own view, right? You see view, 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 and view. So whichever view you're actually bringing in your reference image, that's the view it's going to essentially get assigned to or attached to. So I want to do this in my perspective because it's not really an orthographic like direct front view or side view kind of image. It's more of like a 3/4 profile view type of thing. So in my perspective view, I'm going to go to my same view at the top, and then I'm going to go to my image plane and then say import image. Now I want you guys to be aware of the following. As soon as you go in there, it's going to give you an option to, you know, choose where you want to load the file from. But if you've set everything up correctly like we've done now, then it automatically goes to the source images folder of your particular set project. Thus it's easier to then go and pick the image instead of having to redirect to a different directory and going and find your reference. So I have that selected. I'm going to hit open, and there it is. There's my image. Now it's stuck to the camera. So if I rotate the camera, it's always in my view. Not really useful in this particular situation. But yeah, just trace it, guys. Just line up your perspective and hey, look at that, it's sitting there. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the options to manipulate how the image plane is being projected onto my perspective view. You can change the transparency, you can change the width and height, you can even change the there's a few options I'm going to show you guys. Yes. So now, this is the first time we're actually going to talk about the difference between the channel box and the attribute editor. So I'm going to quickly open up Photoshop just to kind of explain the differences between the two. Think of it this way. So you've got Big Brother and Little Brother. So you've got the channel box, and then we've got the attribute editor. Okay. So what's the difference between these guys? The channel box gives us the most common used channels, like translate, rotate, scale, visibility, those kind of things. So I'm just going to write in brackets here: translate, rotate, and scale, visibility, and that's pretty much it. Those are your default standard object manipulation kind of controls. Then obviously you can add on top of that additional tools, like let's say you extrude an object or a set of faces, you're doing a multi-cut, you're doing a bevel. All those things that you add additionally, those are called nodes. Okay, or you can think of them as little connections that's feeding into this object. Let's say the object is a little box, right? So then I apply different tools like extrude. We've got bevel, and so on and so forth. So let's say we have 5 or 6 tools that we're using. So every time we apply a specific tool to this particular object, we're essentially expanding the network or dependencies of what this object is dependent on. If you were to break the connections between the extrude, the bevel, and so on and so forth, then the shape suddenly goes back to its original position just before you've physically applied that particular function or tool. So every time we apply a new extrude, that particular extrude applies an input connections. Okay, so the input, and then we have all the tools that we essentially apply to our model. So that's, let's say, tool extrude, bevel, bridge, so on and so forth. So that's the type of information that you will typically receive in your channel box. Now think of the inputs as essentially a history stack. So that's going to be your history. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth as we go along. So what's the difference between this guy and this guy? Well, the attribute editor gives us a lot more intricate details about every tool, every action, every history node physically applied to that mesh. It gives you options in whether things would be renderable, if things can show up in reflections and refractions, all those kind of additional features. So this is the big brother, okay? The big bro, and this is the little bro. Okay, that's essentially the difference between the two. So you would typically find the most commonly used attributes or simplified set of attributes in the channel box, and then the attribute editor gives you more functionality or more flexibility in tweaking and adjusting certain values. You would typically get the same extrude in the channel box as you would get in the attribute editor. It's just a different way that it lays it out for you to go and change the properties for so on and so forth. So you've got the common attributes, and being the same stuff as this, plus additional tools, or I wouldn't say tools, additional, well, attributes. Okay, that's essentially how these two work together. So let's see what that looks like inside of Maya. So if I go and look at my image plane at the moment, this image plane is kind of stuck on screen, and I essentially want to shrink it down, and I want to move this image plane off to the side so that it's not kind of blocking my view while I'm doing my modeling and all those fancy things. So by looking at the channel box, you can see the image plane is currently selected, the actual shape of it, and then we have attributes like offset, we have attributes like width and height, and so on and so forth. So these are the more common related attributes that you would typically get for the actual image plane. Now if I go to the attribute editor, we essentially find, in this case, just the top tab. It's saying image plane and then shape, with the same set of attributes but a lot more involved, describing each of those attributes more in detail that you can then go and edit as you like. You can see there's more tabs expanding down at the bottom, whereas the channel box provides you the more commonly used or adjusted attributes. Right, so all I want to do is grab the, let's say X goes across the horizontal axis and Y goes up and down. If I type in a particular value, let's quickly see if we can do this. Where is it now? 5 units to the right or to the left, depending on whether you say -5 or 5. So that's way far out. It's not even in view anymore. So let's put it back to 1. Okay, now we start to see something. So if I type in 0.5, I want to go the other way. Let's do -0.5. Right, so you can change those attributes as you like. It's sometimes a bit of a tedious process to find the exact value as you essentially type them in. You don't really know whether that's going to be an exact position or not. So a cool trick that you can use is if you click on the name attribute, the name, not the value, the name, then you can use your middle mouse button in your viewport to give you an interactive slider. Okay, the middle mouse activates the little slider as if it was like a dial that you can tune in and out, and that gives you a nice way of quickly placing that as an interactive approach instead of having to type in a specific value. Together with that, if you hold down Control and middle mouse, that's going to give you even more sensitivity, so you can actually change the values on a smaller incremental level. So what I want to do is first scale the image plane down and then get the height position as well as the horizontal position. So let's quickly look at the height position. If I grab that and I hold down Control, middle mouse, click and drag. Okay, so the value is changing, but it's not changing the attribute. So these are sometimes linked together as like a constraint. They're essentially constrained together based on the image dimensions. So if I change any of these, they're not changing the value. So how does that work? Well, for some reason these attributes can only be adjusted in the attribute editor. I think this is a Maya bug since few versions back. So I think it might be scale that they've translated to. Yep, so now you can use the scale instead of the image width values here. And when you hold down Control and then middle mouse click in your viewport, you can then go and scale it down until you find the right size. And then from there, I would then go into the offset and middle mouse drag that up until it's more or less in the top left corner of the screen. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds. So now that we have the image plane kind of placed in position, we want to then start essentially blocking out a basic set of cubes and planes and stuff to kind of create our basic primitive. So I'm going to show you guys my method for blocking these kind of things out. I'm going to do it on a process based where I block out the major volume, and then I'm going to save that out as a separate object. Put it in a reference layer and set the reference layer to template so that it is not an editable mesh, but rather a mesh that represents the bounding box of what the overall volume looks like. Once I have that, I would then go in and create a new mesh. You can actually duplicate the original one and then start refining that one. You don't have to start again from scratch. Anywhere where you can actually reuse something, that's definitely the route to go. So we don't have exact dimensions at the moment to kind of represent the shape. So let's start off with values that I would say kind of make sense. So I'm going to start off with a box, and I'm going to go to my create menu, polygon primitives. I'm going to make sure I turn off the interactive creation. Okay, if you have it on, make sure you turn it off. Just for this case, I'm going to turn that option off, and then under the polygons menu you can just create the box, and that will place an exact 1 by 1 by 1 centimeter box in the center of the world. Very tiny. Can you guys see that? Super tiny little cube. So what we want to do is actually grab that cube and change its inputs values inside of the channel box. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying in describing the difference between the channel box and the attribute editor. You will find the same set of values or set of attributes in either the channel box as well as the attribute editor. So I'm going to show you guys how this works. If I have nothing selected, again, you're not going to see anything popping up. So you're going to have your object selected, and then in the channel box you will see under the inputs there's something called a polycube 1. So the polycube 1 comes by default with every cube. If you were to create a cylinder, you'll probably find a polycylinder 1 attribute. And what's inside of this attribute, if you click once on it, it's going to actually expand a list of additional channels, and then you can change those dimensions and values to kind of estimate a proper scale to your model. So if I want to have this to be, let's say the width over there is about 45 meters, then I go to my width and I type in 500 meters, or 500 centimeters. There we go. And that's going to be exactly, if we look at the grid, move this off to the side, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 500 centimeters. Height-wise, let's say it's going to be a height of more or less 2.4. So 240. And then the depth, we want to have it more or less like, let's say 7 meters, 8 meters. We can check. Let's do 700. Yeah, that's quite close. I think that's going to be a pretty decent bounding box for our little house. Okay, so just by setting these default parameters as a starting point for our creation of the model, we're already preparing it for scale. You don't have to go and actually use the scale parameters with the X, Y, and Z to kind of off scale that from the default space. It doesn't really matter whether you use the scale or the actual inputs with width, height, and depth. It doesn't really matter. It's easier to use the width, height, and depth and type in exact centimeter values, because those are directly linked to the units that you're essentially using. Whereas you're using a scale, that's an additional scale on top of your initial subdivisions, if I can call it, sorry, your initial width, height, and depth parameters. So if I were to set my width, height, and depth, let's say all 5 centimeters, and then I go to my scale X and I make only my scale X, let's say 2, then my whichever axis represents the width, let's say width is X, then I'm going to have 5 times 2 of the scale, and that's going to start distorting the shape beyond its default parameters. So just think of it that way. So either you say, I'm not really too concerned about the exact dimensions, so I'm not going to worry whether the width, height, and depth is preset. Let's say the default is always going to be 1, 1, and 1 centimeters. Then I can use the quick scale to kind of drag it out and to get it to the dimensions that I want. So it doesn't really matter whether you use scale or width. If you want to be more precise, you would probably end up using width and height more. But if you're just free-flowing, free-shaping objects, scale is perfectly fine. You don't have to go into the additional options. With that being said, if we go and actually open up the attribute editor, a shortcut for that is Control A. Okay, Control A cycles between the attribute editor and the channel box. So by hitting Control A, that's going to give you a cycle between, like I said, the channel box and then the attribute editor. So suddenly, now if we look at the attributes for the box, do you guys see there's multiple tabs here at the top? Not just a single tab like with the image plane. So a piece of mesh by default starts off with multiple connections or inputs. It has the cube, the first tab, that relates to the actual translate or transform attributes. Things like your translate X, Y, Z, your rotate X, Y, Z, so on and so forth, and your display options like visibility, many different tabs. We've got information to related to the actual shape, things like whether you want something to display at render time. I'm not going to go too in depth in any of these. I'm sure as we go along I'll reveal more specific features that I want to address. From there we have things like the polycube. Now if you click on polycube, it reveals you exactly the same values as what we have input in the polycube over here. So it's the same node, exactly the same node that's accessible from two different places in Maya. Okay, sometimes you want to have a slider. Instead of having to go here, click on a name and change the value there. It's all preferences. It doesn't really make sense to use both at the same time. But if you prefer one, use that. If you prefer the other, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to break workflow or any of that. Additionally, we're going to have an initial shading group, and then lastly we're going to have a little Lambert tab. So if you click on these little arrows on the top right corner, it's going to reveal additional tabs. Now every time that I do an extrude, a bevel, a multicut, a combine, whichever additional modeling tools, I'm essentially expanding the tabs list at the top. Then you're going to have multiple extra buttons at the top. So just be aware of that, so that you're not going to get to a point where you can't find whichever. The Lambert's always going to be on the right hand side, the furthest right hand side node. So this list might extend over 1,000 nodes, especially when you've been modeling for hours and you've done many merge vertices and multicuts and all those things. So that will typically end up being this huge list, and you're going to probably click on this and hold it down for some time to go through all the way to the end before you get to the Lamberts. Why is that so important when we get to the shading part, when we start texturing and so on? Lambert is essentially the thing that allows us to see the shaded information on the surface. Okay, so that's essentially what type of surface it is, like wood, plastic, rubber. You can actually preset and predefine those particular parameters. For now, I'm just kind of talking you guys through the different attributes and what's related to one another. Channel box, attribute editor, same thing. One expands with more options, the other one gives you a more compact list of attributes. Okay, right, now that we know and we've set these values, we want to now start adding additional edits to the mesh. This is where we use the tools that we already talked about, like the insert edge loop tool, or rather the multicut, like the extrude tool, the bevel tool, the bridge tool, so on and so forth. So those are the tools we're actually going to use today. If you haven't set those values yet, I'm going to give you a minute. So looking at this box and looking at our image plane, we are going to try and create this little roof piece rising up to the top. So there's a few ways of approaching it, but we want to try the easiest and quickest way to get to that. And the easiest way that I know of from a few years of experience is going to be just the multi-cut, and then I'm going to hold down Control and then holding down Shift together and then get it to be exactly in the middle. There's another way that you can approach this. Instead of having the incremental snaps, if you just hold down Control and middle mouse click anywhere on this edge, it will automatically snap and place one right in the center. So that's quite nice. It's a little quick way of placing an exact center edge loop. So once I have that edge loop placed, I want to then select that edge. I'm going to go to edge mode, right click, edge mode. I'm going to select the edge, jump to my move tool, and then I'm going to move this up along the y-axis until I have more or less the height that I would expect it to be. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that. We now want to kind of prepare this mesh a little bit more, where we actually introduce another loop going across the horizontal direction. I'm going to use the multi-cut again, and you're going to see something quite interesting. The length distance between this edge and this edge is obviously different. One is longer, the other one shorter. So what the insert edge loop tool or multi-cut does, it will automatically try to compensate the width or the length of a particular edge to always have the same percentage going across the length. So in certain situations you don't want that. Unfortunately, there's no quick way of fixing it. You'll just have to move the points manually afterwards. So if I hold down Control and I hover over that, can you guys see that the closer I go to one edge, the more it's pinching to the top. The more I go to the other side, the more flatter it becomes. Okay, so we want to have it more or less in the top range, just above. If you look at the actual roof over there, it's a few centimeters higher than the actual frame of the window. So what I'm going to do is more or less estimate that height position based on this particular vertex where my mouse cursor is. I'm going to click on that. That's going to place a point, or rather the loop going across. The only issue now is that this vertex and the vertex on the back is essentially the wrong height. I want to have them exactly the same height as this one at the bottom. So what we can do is we can scale not just objects, we can also scale components. So if we select the whole loop going around the model, we can use the scale tool to flatten that until that line kind of pinches to a straight line. So that's one way. Another way would be to actually select the components being the vertex and then snap align that to another vertex along a particular axis, whether it's the X, the Y, or the Z. So I'm going to choose the first method because it's probably the easiest one. The other one involves more techie kind of stuff like snapping. We will still get to snapping a little bit later. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to select use my selection tool, and I'm just going to double click on the actual edge. So by double clicking on an edge, it will try and follow the loop all the way around the model until it either terminates at a point where it doesn't know which direction you want to go and continue selection, or if it's completely closed. Okay, so I'm going to double click on that, and that's going to show you the whole selection going around. Otherwise you would have been like select, then shift click, all the way around until you have the whole loop selected. So just double clicking on it does a quick loop select for you, and it knows what you want to do for the most part. Once I have that loop selected, I'm just going to use the scale tool. The scale tool is quite simple. You go to scale, and I'm going to click and drag my y-axis. It's going to distort the mesh a bit, so just don't freak out. Don't freak out. It's going to try and find the average position between the highest point and the lowest point of my components, and then that's where it's going to place the manipulator. So if I scale this now, watch what happens with the bottom edge and watch what happens with the top edge. Okay, it's not broken. don't be alarmed. You can always go back to the move tool and just manually move the whole loop down to more or less the position that you want it to be. Now that we have the actual loop going across the model, we can now essentially take this face and extrude them to kind of create the framing for the actual window. Okay, for me to do this, I need to essentially think of a few things. I need to look at the depth of how far it is from the center of the edge on either sides, and also I need to think about the extrusion going into the body of the house and how deep that would be. So how many extrudes do you guys think it would take to get to that result? Just looking at this reference. For 4 extrudes. Okay, someone else? 4, we've got 4 here. Okay, we're not talking about the hyper details, like the actual in-between bits and the actual glass panes. We're just talking about the depth. Think of it as the wall itself, the thickness of the wall. Like if you look there at the window there, that thickness. So if I were to do both at the same time, it's probably going to be the easiest. Instead of doing one with a set of values and another with another set of values, and then suddenly the window is a little bit smaller on this side and a little bit longer on the other side. So if you want exact measures to be on either side, it's probably better to have both faces selected while doing it. But the only problem is, while you have 2 faces selected, like we had in the previous class, when you extrude 2 faces that's connected or essentially touching each other, you have an option to keep faces together, which will then separate them, so you can actually pull the frame into one another instead of having them to scale together as one big extrude. So that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to go to the face. I'm going to select the face on either sides, and then I'm going to hit the extrude button. So once I do that, again we have the little heads up display panel, and I'm going to use the offset. Just watch for now, guys. I'm going to click on the offset button. I'm going to click and drag this, and as I drag this, can you guys see that both windows are physically attached together? There's no separation along the center line. I want the opposite. I want to have them essentially scale, same offset values, but they want to be separate, or they should be separate rather. So if you click on the keep faces together and drag to the left, it will essentially divide the 2 in half, thus giving us 2 different window panes. And the cool thing is, because we did it on one extrude, it's almost like an instance. Whatever I do to one extrude will essentially apply to the other side for every face that I have selected. So if we look at the kind of profile and the length of the window, we can definitely see our extrude is too wide across the width of the building. So we want to use the little scale box and then drag that in. That's going to give us more like the window frame that we're expecting. So that's one extrude so far. Okay, then I can hit the last command button on the keyboard, which is G. That will apply the last tool or command that we physically used. So if you hit G, it applies another extrude. Or you can just click on the button here at the top to create another extrude. It's very easy to just hit G on the keyboard, instead of having to go to a menu, choose extrude, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to hit G, because if I do not do another extrude, watch what happens if I pull this in. Can you guys see? That's not maintaining that flat wall. So we need to essentially be able to say, leave it there. Now I want to take the shape from where it's currently at and then pull that into the building. Okay, so I'm going to hit G, and then suddenly we're on the second extrude, poly extrude face 2. That tells you it's the second extrude that we've just applied. So now I can just pull this straight in, and that's going to give us the depth of the actual window frame. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that for me. So now that we have done this extrude, we're going to essentially address the front face over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my move tool just to kind of get out of the last extrude that we physically applied. Otherwise, if you stay in it, then you might be messing around with the actual frame, so we don't want to do that. So going from here, I'm going to go to my mesh tools, and then I'm going to click on connect. Now connect works this way. It says connect segments 1. You guys see that little heads up display on the screen. Now the connect tool creates edges between the selected components, okay, whether it's a vertex, an edge, or a face. usually actually only the first two methods. So if I select a face and I add another face to that by holding down shift and click, and I keep doing that, I'm essentially building a connection that's wrapping around. So when you fully enclose the selection going all the way around, it's going to provide you a virtual representation of where the line would be. Going from there, we can then choose a middle mouse click and drag, which will actually give us multi-division. So the more I drag to the right or to the left, it's actually going to give us more division. So you can choose how many you want to cut and break it up into segments, press enter, and you're pretty much done. So that was face selection. So if I undo that and this time switch to, let's say, edge mode, and I go to the same tool and I click on an edge, it actually looks at the edges going along the ring of the building, right? And then accordingly does a same connection. So face selection, you have to actually select all the faces around, whereas in edge mode you can actually just select a single edge and it will try and find the path all the way around that fully encloses it. The connection tool is very useful for this kind of stuff. Let's say you start adding one extra edge to it, then it will not consider it as a loop, but rather you want to direct the path so that it only connects between those two components. So if I now switch to, let's say, a different component type, let's say vertex, then I can essentially select multiple vertices and it's going to find a path connecting through them until the end of the selection. So at this point I only want to have one single edge selected, and that will try to find the path all the way around. And then the last thing I need to do is just hold down middle mouse button, click and drag to the right just one single segment. You can see connect segments 2, divides it exactly in 3 halves. I'm going to press enter and I've now divided it equally into 3 parts. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that. So now that we have those 3 divisions, I'm going to essentially select the outer side faces. Right click, face mode, hold down shift, and add the other one on the opposite side. So once I have those 2 faces selected, what do? Okay, I'm going to hit Control E for extrude, and then because these are not directly connected, I don't need to use the keep faces together option to go off. They're automatically considered as 2 individuals. So I'm just using the offset. Okay, and I'm going to change the width across like this, and that's going to be my window pane. From there, we could actually move these guys closer or further apart if you wanted to. I'm going to keep it simple and leave it as is. You can always go and manually move them if you wanted to. If I were to click on the actual lines, you can see they're shifting to other sides, and that's not necessarily what I want. I want one to move in and the other one to move out, meaning towards each other. So unfortunately the local translate manipulator does not give us the functionality to mirror the options. You have to actually enable mirror or reflect to essentially be able to do something like that. That's something a little bit out of the scope of this course or this particular lesson. I will probably address them in the next class. Okay, so once I'm happy with the position or the depth of the actual frame, I can then go and hit another extrude that will allow us to then pull in to the actual frame of the window. So just do that for me quickly. Right, now for the actual door, I'm going to go to my multi-cuts, which we can just grab from here. I'm going to divide that right through the center using Control and just middle mouse click, and that will place a nice center line going through the mesh. Then you can apply another one on this side and another one on this side, which will then divide them into another half, and that's going to give us the depth or the actual frame for the door. Going from there, I need to take these bottom faces and extrude them to create the actual foundation, because that's something we haven't physically addressed yet. So let's quickly do that as well. I'm going to right click, go to face mode, and I'm going to add all the faces at the bottom of the foundation, and then we're going to do one single extrude going down. If I click on extrude, I'm going to pull the thickness out, and let's make that a good 20 centimeters maybe, or 25 even. That should be good. So now we have a loop specifically for the foundation based off of the reference image, and then we have a nice section for these two faces to then be extruded for the door. So lastly, I'm going to hit extrude with these two faces selected for the door, and I will be pushing them into the mesh to create the door frame, and that should be good for what we want. So once we have all those details added to the actual inner frame of the door, we could then start looking at more intricate kind of details. We will be extruding the actual staircase from here. We will also be adding the additional kind of chimney, and currently if we look at the roof and looking at the reference, we can see it's kind of like a separate surface kind of sticking out on the silhouette, and we can see that the actual chimney has a little bit of a trim piece as well. So those are big changes, big things that actually changes the overall silhouette of the building. So when I usually work with my models, I primarily focus on my silhouette, or my rather outer shape, if that's more easier to understand. Because when we work with a mesh, you need to be able to make that mesh or character, even sketching something out on paper, you have to try and be very obvious what this thing is that you're actually making. Because when you're seeing that object from a distance, even in bad lighting conditions, you still want to be able to recognize what it is. I mean, if you look at Mickey Mouse, for instance, we are all very familiar with the silhouette of Mickey Mouse, right? So it's something that we instantly recognize, and that we can kind of expect what the cartoon is about, or whatever the situation might be. In this case, we're actually looking at anything that's sticking out of the mesh, anything that's big silhouette changing shapes. Those are the things that you want to add to your mesh. So in this case, the staircase is definitely a big element. The roof profile, that's another big element, and then definitely the chimney. So that's the three things that I would like to extrude and add to the actual mesh. So when we get into the next lesson, that I show you more intricate specific details, like the actual framing of the windows, little door bevels. If you look at this actual door, it has like an inset frame piece, and the actual knob, and so on and so forth. So those things are more intricate details. So for now, we're just going to focus on the big shapes, and then in the next lesson we'll go on to the next parts. So let's stick to the most simplified things first. This right there, the actual the staircase. So if we look at these four faces over here, that's more or less the width of what we want to extrude. The only thing is, currently, the base of the foundation, if you will, for the actual building, seems to have a certain height, and the stairs have exactly the same set of height. So at the moment, for me personally, that's probably the width of one stair. Definitely not want to go and divide this in half so you have a very thin slate or slab of cement. So what I'm going to do additionally is maybe either pull these faces a little bit further down and then add one extra multicut going through the center. I could either do that, or I can reselect the same faces that we had previously and do another extrude with the same thing. You will end up with exactly the same results, with a division running through the center that you can go and then tweak. So I'm going to show you guys the quickest way. I'm going to have these faces select, and once I have the faces selected, I'm going to pull this a little bit further down, more or less like that, and then use a multi-cut and divide that exactly through the center. Now we can kind of see what we're looking at. So if I have these set of faces selected and then extrude once, Control E, I'm going to pull that forward more or less around about there, and then lastly I want to deselect the top faces because they shouldn't go along with the extrusion, and then do another extrude and pull that out, and that's going to give us our little step. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to do that for me. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to have all the faces selected that represents the roof. Okay, I'm going to have them selected, and this time I'm going to show you guys a quick shortcut to have multiple faces selected very quickly. So if you have one face selected and you hold down Tab, Tab activates a command that essentially allows you to ray select, or what's the right word? It's like a paint selection kind of approach. So I can literally click and drag on the mesh and it's going to select those faces, instead of you having to hold shift and then click, 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 click all the way through the selection. That's very nice, very quick way of painting a selection. Once you have those faces selected, we essentially want to do some sort of an extraction or duplication of the existing faces. For this scenario, I'm going to use the duplicate face, and we can find this option under the edit mesh, and then you'll see right at the bottom, essentially this is kind of divided into like segments. At the top you can see it's called components. So all the major tools that essentially work in any of the component type modes, whether it's vertices, edges and faces, they essentially apply to all of those. Then we have specific tools that only works in vertex mode, certain tools only working in edge mode, and certain ones only in face mode. So the one that we want to use is under face, and that's called a duplicate. So I'm going to click on that, and I want you guys to watch what happens once I hit the actual button. It's going to now suddenly go back to almost like an object mode, but it keeps it in a form of like an extrude tool manipulator. So how this works is you can see the actual heads up display says poly chip off. So it actually took the faces, made a duplicate, and it's kind of chipping them off, almost like little, pieces falling off. And then we have the option to control this to move out or in on a local direction. We can either use the blue arrow, or we can click on local Z and then inflate that like that. Okay, so what I want to do is just inflate it a tiny bit further, or just so that we can distinguish between the selections. Okay, once I have done that, I'm going to go to select, and now I can either select this mesh or the other mesh in object mode or face mode, or whichever component mode you prefer. Let me switch back to object mode, right click object mode so it's more clear. So you can see that's the selection and that's the selection. If I have both selected, that's what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to quickly do that. So the next thing that I want to do to make this a little bit more of a useful piece of geometry is that the roof itself at the moment is a single-sided face, right? It doesn't have thickness. So to make this a thickened version of that object, we essentially need to select the faces and do what to it? Yes, simple extrude. I'm going to right click, face, make a selection, and then go to extrude, and then pull the thickness out until we have that set up. Okay, so continuing from here, I'm now going to get rid of any unnecessary edges on the roof, because remember, if we look at the initial house, we can see that the initial house has edges running across the width of the roof, just so that we had the necessary edges to kind of extrude this out, or in rather. So looking at the roof, that's a duplicate face from the initial roof, thus we have the same set of edges. So I'm going to try to get rid of these guys. So how you remove components if you've applied them is to go to the component mode that you want to remove. Usually it's going to be edge mode. You can't really delete vertices if they're already connected to other edges. So you need to go to edge mode, and this time I know that this is a loop going all the way around, because when you do an extrusion it actually keeps the connection from all sides. So if I were to double click on each of these loops, holding down shift obviously to add to the selection, I would easily be able to add them all to my selection. And then I need to delete the edges. So how do I do that? I can press delete. Now watch very carefully. If I press delete, that's good, looks nice, happy times. But if I go to vertex mode, you'll actually see it leaves the existing edges from the original, existing vertices from the initial edges. So you want to then go and delete those as well. Now, is that a process that's quite conducive to a good workflow? I don't think so, because you're going to forget about it and then later on realize, hey, my multicut is not working, my bevel is not reacting the way it's supposed to, and it's going to be a mess. So the best way to go about this is, I'm going to undo this. There's two ways you can delete these. You can either go to edit mesh and then say delete edges dash or / vertices. Is that backslash? I think that, or whatever. Or you can hit Control Delete. That will remove both the edges and the vertices. So do not just hit delete, hit Control Delete if you want to remove both the edges and the vertices. That's a very nice way of cleaning it up. So removing that, if I now go to vertex mode, you can see they're not there anymore, they're nice and clean, and that's what I want. So the next thing that I want to do is decide on the width of the actual chimney. So what I'm going to do is use my multi-cut. There we go, multi-cut. I'm going to hold down Control. I'm going to hover more or less where I want to have the first edge loop to be placed. And this is going to be the border on the left hand side of the chimney. So I'm going to place it more or less there. And then I'm going to have the one on the closer to us screen based. I'm going to do that right there, split it up, and that's going to be the width of the actual chimney. The only thing that I still need to do now is add 2 localized loops going down the length. And so instead of using the multi-cut, I think we're all quite comfortable with using that by now. Let's use a different tool. Let's use the connect tool. So I'm going to go to mesh, connect, and I need to be in edge mode. Click on that. You guys see that nice split, exactly even. And then the cool thing is the actual connect tool has multiple other options internally, and the only way for us to have access to that is going to the modeling toolkit. So if I click on the modeling toolkit, it's going to reveal that the connect tool is currently active, the blue one on the right hand side. And then just below that, it gives you all the options for the connect tool. So currently it is set to segments. So the segments gives us divisions going across the length of the selected edge. Okay. We can then also switch to slide, which will kind of slide them all up and down. So that's nice. And then finally we have a pinch option, which will allow us to pinch these closer or further apart. Okay, so that's a nice way of kind of approximating the distance you want. Switch to whichever one you want, and once you're happy, we're going to press enter and you should be done. Now the way I was controlling them as an interactive manipulator is just middle mouse. When you hold down middle mouse and you choose whichever option, whether it's pinch or segments or slide, it's either going to do a slide or a pinch or a segments interactively. Okay, so quickly do that for me. Add those 2 additional loops. So finally, we can now take that selected face, or rather that face that we've essentially prepared for the extrusion, and we're going to have that selected, hit extrude, and watch carefully now. As soon as I do the extrude, this line will go at a diagonal direction. Can you guys see that? If I were to pull that, it's obviously I don't know if anyone has a chimney like that. But yeah, you can go for that if you like. So what I want to do instead is, now instead of using the local extrude manipulator, I want to switch back to the regular world transform tool. Okay? So by just switching to the move tool, I can now pull this straight up instead of going at a diagonal direction. So the only last thing that I need to do is get this chimney profile at the top to be nice and flat. So what's the last tool that I would use for this? Yes, we're going to use the scale tool. So I'm going to hit scale tool and then flatten these two, and that's more or less that. And we have it. Pretty quick and easy extrusion for the chimney. Okay guys, I think that's it for today, and I think in the next lesson I will start talking about the more intricate details, like the trim pieces for the windows, for the doors, for the chimney, and so on and so forth.